morning. It's really an amazing pleasure to be here. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of what family is to my work, and also the work that I think we're all trying to do here, and then move a little bit into the science, and then share a couple of projects that we've been working on that I think start to lay some groundwork for some of the things that we want to talk about today. I wanted to start by saying that my first job was as a community organizer in Baltimore City. And I don't know if any of you have ever been to Baltimore, but it's a very amazing city. It's a city of communities. It's a city of neighborhoods that are very connected to each other. And I worked as a community organizer for 5 years. And what I kept trying to understand was, what were the ways that you could have big change? And I kept looking at housing and at education and at nutrition, and that led me to sort of start to look at the research around what was happening in those areas and how we ultimately thought about how we expressed ourselves. So my work at Johns Hopkins really has come out of being a practitioner, being on the ground. I'm a social scientist. I'm really interested in how things work. And so the talk that I want to give today really is sort of exploring sort of how do you really investigate and look at these things, and in some across multiple methods. So I'll talk about neuroscience, but also public health, and really thinking about what are the ways that we gain knowledge and how does that knowledge become usable. So in our lab, we believe that families are the heartbeat of the world. And we have a basic premise that home is where our stories begin. And so really understanding what does home mean? And home for all of us means something different. But for all of us, home, a baseline is safety. And so if there's not safety at home, you can't learn, you can't grow, you can't thrive. And so when you really begin to understand at a very sort of take a deep breath and think about what home means, home becomes the ground where we plant our seeds, and what has to happen there. So all of the work in child development that you'll hear about today starts with this idea of what developmentally you need to have at home. And you may even say that home begins in the womb, and that's really a place where we want to think about what our origins are and how the genetics of gestation really help to begin to shape who we are. Families are filled with hope. Hope is the single biggest variable for how we thrive in the world. If we don't have hope, we don't have the ability to thrive. And so when we think about stress and anxiety and depression in our communities and in our cities today, without hope, positive outcomes, we're not able to really envision a future for ourselves, for our families, or for the community. There's an idea around intention that's building in the scientific community about how you think about intuition and the desire to have an outcome, and really putting that intention out there. And there's a lot more work around consciousness and intention. So, 99% of what we know is unconscious. It's between 1% and 2% is really our conscious thought. So intention tends to be an unconscious phenomena, and we're beginning to understand more and more about what this idea of intention looks like. And then what do we think about dreams? And I don't only mean dreams, daydreams, but what are our dreams telling us, and what is our sleep allowing us to do? So at a neurobiological level, if you're not sleeping, you're not able to clean off your synapses and move that information into storage, whether that's long-term, mid-term, short-term, so that you can really become conscious and move into the world the next day. So thinking about what dreams do for you, what sleep does for you, and how that helps to create a healthy body in order to be in the world. In my lab, we look at art and play, and we believe that arts and play change your brain. And just to break it down, arts is not an elite concept. We think about architecture, film, digital media, immersive media. We think about handcraft. We also look at music. We look at dance. And we look at play in terms of imagination, in terms of creativity. It's play as a way of being in the world. So these 2 4-letter words ultimately get in a box really fast. But if you just let your mind wander about what what do you do every day that is artful? How do you play? You know, and it may be the way you decided what you're going to wear today, or how you did your hair, or how you made breakfast, or just how you thought about your creativity and moving into a space. This idea of artfulness and playfulness are hardwired. They're part of our DNA. They're evolutionarily documented in terms of our ability to be able to express ourselves and also to understand the other, so both as a maker and a beholder. So, and they change our brains. They change our brains at a structural level. They change our brains at a neurobiological level. And we believe that they make us happier, healthier, and smarter. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of what we do in our lab to illustrate some of the things that I think we're trying to get at today. So we are a multidisciplinary research lab that is at the Brain Science Institute at Johns Hopkins. We're in the School of Medicine. So what's super cool about that is medicine thinks art and play are important, and they want to understand it. And I think that as some wind in the sail of this field is really important, because we all know intuitively that the arts and play matter, but we haven't been able to really understand it at a neurobiological or even societal level. So the more we look at mixed methods to understand it, it's not to validate it, but it's to help us be able to use it in a bigger way, in a scalable way, and a sustainable way. So our mission is to amplify human potential, and that can take lots of twists and turns, and I'll share a little bit about that. The field that I work in is called Neuroaesthetics. We sort of shorthand it and we call it neuroarts. And basically what we're interested in is exploring the sensory experiences that we all have that affect our body and our behavior. So how do these things change our brain? That's interesting. But how do they change our behavior? How do we become different? How do we grow and change and learn and even heal, because these things are part of who we are? And I'll just underscore again, space, architecture, light, design, because in this context we're thinking about all of those things. But yes and, yes and. And what's happening in our minds and in our bodies when we're having these experiences. And I'll talk a bit about that too. And then what's the impact? What's changing? What's happening in terms of our health, our well-being, and our learning? So Anjan Chatterjee is a neurologist at University of Pennsylvania, and he's developed this aesthetic triad. Another thing that I think is super fantastic, if it's a superpower of this field, is that each of us experience the world based on genetics, our conditioning, and our experiences different. So when I say I think something's beautiful, Helen may say I think something's beautiful. We're defining beauty differently. We are using our own perspective. So we may all have a common sense of what's beautiful or what's meaningful, but it's subtle, it's nuanced in how we have come into the world, experience the world. And what Anjan is basically trying to show us in a model is that knowledge and meaning, that sort of this contextual, cultural experience, sensory motor perceptions, my sensory motor perceptions are different than each of you. We're different in how we respond to something, or what my cognitive load is versus what my visual system is. So that has its own sort of alchemy, unique alchemy. And then the third is looking at what we believe what the rewards and emotional kind of payoff is for what we experience. So that comes together to give us a unique, I think of it as an aesthetic fingerprint. It's a unique sort of fingerprint on how we see an aesthetic experience. So while we all may share values of the same things, we experience them at different levels and in different ways. And this model, I think, is a frame that we can think about as we're designing cities and designing spaces, and even thinking about apartments and housing and any kind of place, hospital, waiting rooms. How do you create something that's good for the collective, knowing that the individual is going to experience it in their own unique way? Colors like that too. Color has its own very deep cultural connection. So not everybody thinks blue is the best color, for example, while we know that blue is a common color. So a couple of things in terms of level setting for research that I think scientifically will be helpful for today. One is that looking at this process of perception And that's really looking at how information enters our bodies and our brains. So looking at vision, looking at smell, looking at touch, looking at taste, and looking at motor, how motor sensory experiences really enter our system. And we know a lot about how the brain biologically perceives stimuli and what it does with that information in terms of an orchestra of different parts of the brain. So, we may bring in something, a loud sound, and that's going to immediately affect our amygdala, and that's going to set off a fear. Oh, what was that? We're afraid of it. How do you process that information into the hippocampus, where you're going to store that as a memory? You can take that all the way from a normal experience where you hear a sound and it's not something, and it might scare you, but it doesn't change you structurally. It's something that you become aware of. Take that experience all the way to a traumatic experience, like something that might happen in sexual trauma, in childhood trauma, in war trauma, and that sound that you resonate with becomes a traumatic memory. And so your amygdala is always firing when you hear that sound. And so thinking about how does perception work in the brain helps you think about how that might downstream be translated into other kinds of models. It turns out that our reward system for humans is so important. Food, sleep, sex, awe, wonder. How does that system get activated, and how can we use that in positive ways? A good example here is that with the opioid crisis, we know that there are other stimuli that can actually work in very similar ways to opioids. So when you're having an awe experience, when you're in a transcendent experience, it actually resonates at the same level as some opioids and also some other kinds of psychedelics. So we're starting to be able to study what does reward mean for us, and how do we think about reward in context to self and to community. The default mode network is another model system that we've been looking at, and this is a system that's sort of mid-brain, and it connects it's located where it connects both spheres of the brain, both hemispheres of the brain. And it's the part of your brain that connects other systems when you're looking inward. So when you are reflecting on something as opposed to understanding the other or the outside, how you sort of configure what's important to you is sort of this default mode network. And we're understanding more and more about how that triggers empathy, creativity, and imagination. Implicit bias, it's a foundational theme that we think about in terms of social justice and inequity, and that's very amygdala based as well. It's very fear-based. So when you don't understand the other, you are sort of tapping into this sort of very old, primal, limbic system that's saying, I don't get it, I'm afraid. And so you start to sort of think about distancing. So the more we understand about implicit bias from a neurobiological perspective, the more we're able to start to think about how do we solve for that, and how do we create environments where we don't come in with the kind of implicit bias and privilege that I think allows us to distance ourselves or judge. And there's a lot of judging and implicit bias. And then the last area that I think is important for today is this idea of embodied cognition. How do you feel what you feel? How does the world sort of come into you, and how do you bring that back out? So how does that really make us feel different? And what do we know when we have embodied a new way of feeling? And that work is you're going to hear a lot about that over the next couple of days, but I think the embodied cognition is really being more conscious in your body. How do you feel? And I'm going to show you a video that is interesting about how much we think we know how we feel, which is really different than how we may always actually feel, because we're thinkers. We think we're thinkers, but in actuality we're feelers, and sometimes we don't feel. So embodied cognition sort of moves us into that. Like, what do you really feel, as opposed to what do you think you feel? So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here in the interest of time, but in a lot of the work that we're looking at, we're exploring moments and places that matter most to families. So everyday moments, celebrations, special moments, story keeping, twists and turns, like what happens when things go wrong, current events, how are we responding to the barrage of things that happen to us at a national level and international level, but even just current events in our communities and in our homes, school and learning and special needs, and what does that really look like? I thought the video on Conscious Cities was interesting because you could see that there are moments where you have an opportunity to dial into something. So it could be a celebration, it could be an everyday moment, it could be where you're really either collecting or sharing your stories. And how do we do that? We do it at the dinner table, we do it in schools, we do it in places that are very natural. So what we've been thinking about is where are those natural places for families where things just are already happening. So you're not adding more, you're saying let's elevate, let's expand the consciousness within these spaces. And we use a model, and Itai was mentioning this, called impact thinking. It's a model that we developed at the Arts and Mind Lab. It's now a 9-step process that really looks at how do you create a consensus framework when you're trying to solve a problem. And for us, we try to solve problems through the lens of arts and play. So we first look at what's the problem we're trying to solve for. Then we sort of do what we call collaborative discovery. And some of you may know in science there's a scientific method where you do a literature review. Well, think about this as a literature review on steroids. It's asking questions, it's going into the community, it's doing literature reviews, not just in one field, but in 10 fields. It's trying to look at exemplars and really sort of understanding a problem through multiple lenses. Very similar to what we're doing today, where we're saying, I got a problem. How would you come at this from a sociologist's point of view, from a public health point of view, from a neurology point of view? How do you really break this apart and put it back together? After that, we sort of say, okay, based on what we think we know, what's the hypothesis? What do we think is really going to happen here? We design a research study, and that's often mixed methods where we're looking at biology, we're looking at behavior, we're looking at public opinion, and then we test it. And then we often will do an analysis, and that will move us into refining and retesting and making recommendations on our way to dissemination and scaling. What's really interesting is in these science fields, there's a lot of things that we know that never get disseminated, that never get scaled, that never become sustainable. And so the 9th piece that we're adding, because we're now moving so much into this dissemination place, is looking at the impact of the dissemination. So if you don't have a metric for what success looks like, it's hard to know whether you got there. So we have, through Itai's work, we've been moving more towards thinking about what are the metrics for success and what does that really look like. So just very quickly, a couple things that we're looking at is we're looking at, we have a lot of what if questions. So what if you could design a space for promoting healing? We're building a healing room for children with disorders of consciousness using that model. What if you could reduce trauma through art making? We're doing projects in school where children are actually making art. We're also doing it with children of veterans. They're making art and able to create stories that they haven't been able to come to because their language centers have been shut down through trauma. Being able to make art, tell the story through the art, and then begin that healing process. And we're able to measure that. We're able to measure against different kinds of quality of life scales, psychological scales, what kind of impact those kinds of arts are having. We're looking at if you could build resilience through writing, and writing turns out to be an amazing cathartic process for recrafting story and really seeing yourself from an identity point of view where you may not have been able to do that verbally. So some folks and based, going back to the aesthetic triangle, some people prefer writing over visual arts, some people prefer dance. There are certain kinds of modalities that work better depending upon the art form. We're doing a lot of work right now with Parkinson's and dance. And it turns out that when you dance, you don't have tremors. When you dance, you can move. And so there's Mark Morris Dance Company has something called PD for Dance, and it's all over the world where dancers are relieved of their symptoms of Parkinson's 100%. So they're dancing every day, and it's changing their quality of life. We're not curing the disease, but it's changing quality of life. So, and in dance studios all over. And then we're doing a lot of work in Alzheimer's and neurodegenerative disease using singing and using autobiographical sounds, music to really change memory and elicit memory and also reduce agitation. And then looking quite a bit now at how do we strengthen families coming together making art. So we're doing quite a bit of work of what this collaborative process looks like. And in Baltimore, we're doing some work with poetry readings and gun violence and having a whole citywide program where people are reading poetry and talking about how the poetry affected them and how that makes them think about violence, gun violence, decision-making within the community. So this is at a very broad spectrum across the entire community. I wanted to share a resource that I think could be really foundational for the work we're doing here. We just completed something called Creating Healthy Communities, Arts and Public Health in America. It's a report that just came out last week, and it's looking at social exclusion and isolation, chronic disease, collective trauma, racism, and mental health as healthy community variables that we think we can influence by creative placemaking, thinking about environment in very conscious and dedicated ways. And the report looks at 25 communities around the United States, looks at the neurobiology of these 5 areas, the social determinants of health around them, and also looking at recommendations at a policy level, at a practice level, and at a funding level to help support this. And it's available online. You can actually, if you just Google Creating Healthy Communities, Arts and Public Health, you can either find it at the University of Florida's website or at Art Place America. Fantastic resource, and I think lays a lot of foundation for the conversation that we're having today. So I want to close with a project that I worked on with Google. Google is very interested in neuroaesthetics and how space changes you. So they designed a exhibit in Milan, the Milan Design Fair, where it's a very simple experiment. We developed 3 home spaces, living room, dining rooms, with 3 very different aesthetic experiences. And then we created a band that took measurements on variable heart rate, respiration, and galvanic skin response. So what was happening with your temperature when you went through these rooms. And we just put a simple band on each person coming through the space. The first room we called Essential, and it was warm and inviting. There were round walls, very soft, very textural. We created a scent for each room. We created music for each room. So you entered this space, and it was as if you went to a different planet. You were totally sort of surrounded by this space. The second space we called Vital, and it used different light, different color, different sound, different scent. Very sort of energizing. We know a lot about how different scents affect biology in general, but we wanted to sort of see what this space would look like. And then we created the third space, which we called Transformative. And when you walked in that room, you smelled charcoal, you smelled burnt wood, and you had this sort of sense of ancient knowings. Some people did very high ceilings. It was uplit as opposed to downlit. It just had this very, very ethereal kind of quality. And then we took people's bands and we said, all right, in each of those rooms, what was your body doing? And the goal was to see what room you were most calm in. And I think today we're all so wired, we're busy, our bodies are just going like crazy. If you could create a space that would be most calming and at ease, what would you do for that? What would what could you know? So what we found was that it was across the board. Each room was a third, a third, a third. So where our hypothesis was the first room was going to be the room that people really responded to, what we found was that people actually have very different biologies. 50% of the people that came through thought they knew which room it was, and they were wrong. And they were really shocked by the fact that they really thought they knew what they felt because they thought they felt at ease, but they didn't. And so what was really interesting about the experiment was that we're not as connected to our bodies as we think we are. And the more you start to know how you're feeling through by some kind of biometric measure, or just feeling your body more intensely, like if you're sitting here and you're thinking all of a sudden, oh, I'm not getting blood to my stomach, or oh, I'm realizing I've got tension in my neck. We override that because we're so busy. So when you have this ability to really calm, what does calm look like for you? And it may be very different, and that was a really interesting knowing. So I want to play the video of that experience, just so you can kind of see what we heard, and then I will stop there. So now you want to put it on pause? And I should say the architect for this is Suchi Reddy, who is in New York, and she's very interested in the space around how you feel in a space. And I think she's giving a talk in the mental health program.
The way this project is unusual is that we are actually pursuing a principle. I really believe that form follows feeling, and feeling is really what space and architecture are about. Space actually affects people.
Design matters. It's why we spend the time making the decisions we do. Those things that we as designers intuit, neuroscience is now proving have an effect. Google created an exhibition that is showing design's impact on our biology.
The way that I explain neuroaesthetics, it's really simple. It's basically how your brain changes on the arts. When you have a heightened aesthetic experience, like a piece of music, a sunrise, things that really elevate your everyday experiences, they change you. They change your biology, they change your mood, they change your emotion.
I called Suchi Reddy and I said, taking the neuroaesthetic principles, could you create 3 different rooms that would evoke different responses?
The goal is to see how people resonate with space and to really find out whether what they think they resonate with is what their body is actually resonating with.
We respond to the aesthetics of our environments, whether we realize it or not. The band can demonstrate with data from the sensors that actually is happening. Heart activity, respiratory activity, skin temperature, skin conductance. We figure out from the data which room is the one that feels the calmest or the most at ease for people.
Does your physiology feel most peaceful? I think it's what people are searching for. The space between the notes, the place where they can come and just be.
The interiors where we work and where we live have a deep impact on our well-being. We've always known it and believed in it, but we haven't been able to quantify it and prove it. You enter a space and it's like, I like it, but why?
This is about data used as a mirror back to yourself. Data is just a bunch of numbers, and we wanted to make it artistic in its expression.
It can be really hard to put an aesthetic experience into words. But suddenly, by combining science and technology, we get a new language.
We've selected room 2 as the room that you were the most calm in.
Maybe a watercolor can tell more than 1,000 words.
Technology has the ability to help you know yourself better. The problems of the future are only going to become more complicated. Solutions have to happen in this collaboration of technology, the arts, and science. So I did not pick the right room, which is amazing to me, right? So you think you know, sometimes you don't. So anyway, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you.